Okay, so let's be honest. Remembering new words, new vocabulary words, I mean, it can be like a real struggle sometimes, right? It's like you learn it and then it just poof, disappears.
Yeah, it's like you're trying to hold on to sand.
Exactly. But what if I told you there are, smarter ways to learn vocabulary, ways that actually stick? Today, we're diving into this article, and it's called Unlock Your Vocabulary: Smart Strategies to Remember New Words Effortlessly. It sounds pretty promising, right?
It does. I'm really curious what they have to suggest.
Me too. Our mission, if you will, today is to kind of pull out some of those really actionable strategies from this article, the kind that you can just start using today. You know, no more staring blankly at flashcards and hoping for a miracle.
Yeah, flashcards definitely get a bad rep.
They do, they do. So the article makes this really interesting point right off the bat. It's not just about memorizing, brute force memorization. It's about understanding.
Hmm.
And I thought that was fascinating. What do you think about that? Like, why is understanding so important for memory?
Well, if you think about it, how our brains actually work. We're not just like, empty containers just waiting to be filled with facts and figures. We learn by making connections. So, when you really understand a word,
Hmm.
like its nuances, how it relates to other words, it actually becomes part of this like massive web of knowledge in your brain.
Yeah, it's like the difference between cramming for a test versus actually like getting a concept, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And the article gives some really good examples of how to achieve that kind of deeper understanding. Like one thing they suggest is, looking up example sentences online. They mention these websites like Youglish and Linwy.
Oh, yeah, those are great.
Yeah, and it's so helpful because, you see the word being used naturally in all these different contexts, and it just kind of clicks.
Right, it's not just a dictionary definition.
Exactly. Another thing that I find helpful is to, just even look up the etymology of a word. Like, for example, if we break down the word incomprehensible.
Right.
So it's in meaning not, com meaning together, prehens meaning to grasp, and then abable meaning able.
Right.
So suddenly incomprehensible isn't just this big, long, scary word. It's something that you can actually, ironically, grasp.
That's such a perfect example.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
The article also talks about using visualization and creating mini stories to remember words.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about those techniques?
Yeah, those are great. They really tap into the power of, imagery and narrative. Like, remember how we talked about linking the word serene with the image of a peaceful beach?
Yes.
You can make that image even stronger, like even more vivid if you imagine like the sound of the waves, the feel of the warm sand on your skin. It becomes this whole multi-sensory experience.
Oh, yeah, like a mini vacation for your brain.
Exactly, exactly. The article actually gives this example of associating the word ephemeral with the image of a firefly, because it's that kind of fleeting moment of beauty.
Oh, that's really good. Yeah, it's so true. So the more vivid the image or the story that you can create, the more likely you are to actually remember that word. But all these tips are great, but I think sometimes, and I'm curious if you've experienced this too, sometimes I remember a word's definition, but then when I actually try to use it in a sentence, I just completely freeze up.
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, it's
Right.
one thing to, recognize a word when you see it, but it's a whole other level to actually make it part of your, like, actively used vocabulary. And that's where that whole idea of use it or lose it really comes into play.
Right. And the article talks about that a lot, doesn't it? Like the sooner you actually use a new word, the better.
Yeah, definitely. And they give some, some pretty practical suggestions for how to do that. Like writing sentences with the new word is a good starting point. Even just saying it out loud a few times can make a big difference.
Yeah, I find that's true for me too. I think I'm kind of like a kinesthetic learner or an auditory learner. So just saying it out loud really helps. It's funny. I've always found that when I have to teach something, it actually helps me solidify it in my own mind. Like, it's like I have to understand it on a deeper level so that I can explain it to someone else. Do you think that applies to vocabulary too?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, the article even mentions that because teaching, like, it forces you to think really critically about the word's meaning, like all its nuances. You can't just rely on a memorized definition, right? You have to be able to explain it in your own words, and that just solidifies the understanding so much more.
Yeah, that's so cool. So basically, if I want to really master a new word, I should like try to teach it to someone, even if it's just my cat.
Exactly. I mean, it's the act of explaining it, of finding the right words to make someone else understand. That's what really matters.
I love that. So, okay, we've talked about understanding the word, actively using it, even this like unexpected power of teaching.
Oh, and don't forget flashcards.
Oh, yeah, flashcards. How could we forget those? They
Yeah.
kind of get a bad rap, for being boring. But the article actually gives some really cool tips for making them more effective.
Yeah, it's not about abandoning flashcards altogether. It's more about just using them in a more strategic way. And one thing the article mentions is incorporating visual elements. So instead of just writing, melancholy equals sad, you could include like a picture of a rainy day or a wilting flower.
Yeah, that's so much more engaging than just a dry definition.
Yeah.
And it really helps to kind of make that connection in your brain.
Exactly. And the article also highlights the power of spaced repetition.
Oh, yeah. Can you explain that a little bit for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term?
Yeah, so spaced repetition is basically based on this idea that we naturally forget information over time.
Right.
But if we review that information at, increasingly spaced intervals, we can combat that forgetting curve
Hmm.
and actually move that information into long-term memory.
Okay.
And there are all these apps now that do this for you,
Oh, that's amazing.
like Anki and Quizlet, yeah.
So it's like having a personal vocabulary trainer in your pocket.
Exactly, yeah.
That's amazing. Okay, I'm sold. Flashcards 2.0. Here I come. But before we get too carried away with spaced repetition, I do want to kind of jump back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is creating those strong associations to help words stick. And the article had some really fascinating insights on that. What really stood out to you from that section?
Well, I thought it was interesting that they really focused on, tapping into multiple senses and emotions. Like we talked about the beach scene, but you can take it even a step further by like incorporating sounds, smells, even like physical sensations.
Oh, now I'm really craving that beach vacation.
Yeah.
But I get it. The more senses that you engage, the richer that association becomes, right?
Exactly.
And the stronger the memory.
Exactly. And personal experiences are huge too. Like if you can connect a new word to a really strong memory or feeling, it's much more likely to stick. So for example, like think about the word jubilant, right? Instead of just trying to memorize the definition, think about a time when you felt that pure joy. Maybe it was graduating from college, landing your dream job, even just that first sip of coffee in the morning.
Those are really good examples.
I know.
Yeah, it's like building this bridge between the new word and something that already has meaning to you.
Exactly. And, don't forget about rhymes and songs. I know it might sound silly, but our brains love patterns and repetition. So if you're really struggling to remember a word, try coming up with a little rhyme. It doesn't have to be Shakespearean. It just has to be memorable.
Okay, I'm ready to, write a vocabulary rap song.
Exactly.
Seriously, though,
Mm.
I could see how that would be helpful. It's like creating a little earworm for your brain.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And, speaking of making it fun and engaging, the article also mentions, acting out
Oh,
words.
tell me more. I love this idea. It's like you embody the word.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I bet this is especially helpful for people who are like kinesthetic learners.
Oh, absolutely.
People who learn best through movement.
Right. If you're trying to remember the word exuberant, like jump up and down, wave your arms, let out a whoop of joy,
Exactly.
your body remembers too.
Exactly.
I am so doing this. This is like taking vocabulary learning to a whole new level. It's not just about reading and memorizing anymore. It's about experiencing the words.
Exactly. It's about engaging your whole self in that learning process.
Yes. This is making me think about all the different ways that we can just immerse ourselves in language in general. The article talks about reading more, listening to podcasts, even watching movies with subtitles.
Yeah, all of those are fantastic for like passively absorbing new vocabulary.
Yeah, it's like osmosis for the brain.
Exactly. Yeah,
It's amazing how much we can learn without even really realizing it.
for sure.
And also love the idea of keeping a vocabulary journal, like just jotting down any new words that you come across that kind of catch your eye.
Yeah, that's a great way to like personalize the learning experience. It's like you're creating your own custom dictionary.
I love that. Okay, speaking of personalized learning, let's talk about gamification. The article has some really cool suggestions for how to make vocabulary learning feel more like a game. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think games are so effective because they tap into our natural desire for like competition, for achievement, for
Yeah.
rewards. So why not kind of harness that power for good and use it for vocabulary expansion, right?
Absolutely. I'm all about that. So what kind of games are we talking about here?
Well, there are the classics, right? Like crossword puzzles, Scrabble, even Wordle. All of those are great for, testing your knowledge and expanding your mental lexicon.
Oh, Wordle, my nemesis. But seriously, it's amazing how Just a simple word game can make you feel like a vocabulary genius, or at least it exposes the areas where you need to, work on.
For sure. And it's not just about like passive word recognition, right? You're actively searching for words, you're considering different letter combinations.
Like a workout for your brain.
Exactly.
The article also talks about setting up friendly competitions with friends. I love this idea. It's like you add this social element to the learning process, which I think could be really motivating.
Definitely. It's about creating a fun, supportive environment where you can like challenge each other and celebrate each other's successes.
I'm already thinking about who I can challenge. This could get interesting.
Oh, yeah.
But, as we're kind of wrapping up this first part of our deep dive, I'm really struck by the fact that vocabulary expansion doesn't have to be a chore. It really can be effortless, or at least it can feel that way, with the right strategies.
I totally agree with that. It's all about finding the techniques that really resonate with you and incorporating them into your daily life. It's about making vocabulary learning a habit, not a burden.
Exactly. And remember, it's not about memorizing the entire dictionary overnight.
Right.
It's about making small, consistent efforts that are really going to add up over time.
Yeah, it's like building a house brick by brick. Each new word you learn is another brick in your foundation of knowledge. But before we get too philosophical, I think it's time to take a quick break, and we'll come back to discuss why all this effort is actually worth it. Sounds great. Yeah, I think that's a great place to pause. We've given our listeners a lot to think about. So I feel like we've explored a ton of strategies for learning new vocabulary. Everything from really understanding a word's deeper meaning to actively using it, creating those vivid associations, flashcards 2.0. We even talked about gamifying the whole process. It's almost like, we've unlocked this secret level of vocabulary learning.
I know, right? It's a lot, but it's a good kind of a lot. It feels really empowering, to have all these tools at our disposal. And I think it kind of makes you think about the bigger picture too. Like, why does all this effort even matter? Why should we care so much about expanding our vocabularies?
Yeah, that's the key question, isn't it? Like, why bother? Is it just to sound smart and impress people with fancy words? Or is there something more to it?
Right. Because the articles kind of hint at this, but I think it's worth really digging into. Like, it's not just about, sounding intelligent or eloquent. It's about something deeper.
Yeah, definitely. I think a rich vocabulary is really about like unlocking this greater clarity of thought and expression. The more words you have at your command, the more precisely you can actually articulate your ideas, your feelings, your experiences.
Yeah. It's like having this more nuanced color palette to paint with. Instead of just saying good,
Yeah.
you can choose the perfect word to convey that specific shade of good. Like maybe it's exquisite or delightful or marvelous.
Oh, I love that. That's a great analogy. And it goes beyond just, writing or speaking more effectively. Like a larger vocabulary can actually deepen your understanding of the world around you. You're able to grasp more complex ideas. You can make connections that you might have missed before.
Right. It's like you're seeing the world through this like sharper lens. Suddenly you notice details that you hadn't even seen before.
Exactly. And then on a more personal level, I think expanding your vocabulary can even have some like unexpected benefits too.
Oh, like I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
Okay, well, for one, I think it can really boost your confidence. Like when you feel like you can express yourself really clearly and effectively, it naturally increases your self-assurance.
That makes sense.
Right.
Have you ever noticed how like your vocabulary can affect how others perceive you too?
Oh, definitely. Like a strong command of language, it can convey, intelligence, credibility, even leadership qualities.
Right. It's almost like having this secret weapon, in social and professional settings. But it's not just about impressing others, though, right? I think it also has to do with this, like, self-discovery element.
I completely agree. I think as you learn new words, you're kind of forced to explore these new concepts, these new ways of thinking. It can really open up these whole new avenues of intellectual exploration.
It's like your brain is constantly making new connections, kind of expanding its capacity to really process and understand information. And it can make learning itself more enjoyable, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Like when you have the words to describe what you're learning, to make those connections between different concepts, it just becomes so much more engaging.
Right. You're not just passively taking it in anymore. You're actively processing it. Okay, I'm officially convinced. Expanding your vocabulary is about so much more than just memorizing words. It's about becoming a better communicator, a more critical thinker, a more well-rounded individual.
Beautifully put. But let's be realistic for a moment. I can imagine some of our listeners, feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the strategies we've covered, it's like, where do you even begin when there are so many options, so many words to learn? It can feel daunting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It can be a lot to take in. But I think it's important to remember that you don't have to do everything at once.
Hmm.
Start small. Pick, one or two techniques that really resonate with you and just experiment with them.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to adjust your approach as you go along, right? Like what works for one person might not work for another. The key is just to find what feels, fun and sustainable for you.
Right. It's a journey, not a race. And I love that analogy because it really emphasizes that it's about consistency and patience. Like you wouldn't expect to just run a marathon without training, right?
No way.
Building a strong vocabulary is similar. It requires dedication and effort over time, but the rewards are so worth it.
They really are.
And speaking of rewards, I'm reminded of that challenge that the article poses. Remember where it said to, you know, pick 5 new words and try to use them in conversation that day? It's a simple challenge, but I think it's so effective.
Oh, for sure. It's a great way to actually track your progress and see those words become a natural part of your vocabulary.
I think we should issue a similar challenge to our listeners.
Ooh, I love that idea. It doesn't have to be 5 words, but maybe just choose one technique that we've discussed that really stood out to you.
Yes. Try it out for a week and see how it feels. Maybe it's, creating that vivid image for a new word or explaining it to a friend or even just, consciously making an effort to use it in a conversation.
Right. And just making that vocabulary learning a conscious part of your day, even if it's just in these small ways. And we'd love to hear about your experiences.
Oh, absolutely. Share your successes, your challenges, your aha moments. You can leave a comment on the show page.
And who knows, you might just inspire someone else to start their own vocabulary adventure.
Right. But before we all rush off to conquer the dictionary, I think it's worth taking a moment to consider this. We've been talking so much about individual words, but what about developing this deeper appreciation for language itself?
Oh, that's a great point. It's like we've been focusing on the trees, but now it's time to step back and admire the whole forest.
Right. And I think it starts with just simply paying attention.
Mm.
Really listening to the way people use language, the way words weave together to create meaning, to evoke emotions, to tell stories.
Yeah, it's about becoming a word detective, noticing the subtle nuances, the way a single word can just completely shift the tone of a sentence.
And it's about embracing the beauty of language, its rhythm, its flow, its power to kind of transport us to these different worlds and perspectives.
So as you continue on your vocabulary journey, dear listeners, remember that it's not just about memorizing definitions.
It's about cultivating a love for language, a fascination with words, this desire to really unlock the full potential of human expression.
And that's a journey worth taking, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. But before we get too carried away with our newfound love of language, I think it's time to move on to our final thoughts on this fascinating topic. Wow, I mean, we have really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? Everything from specific techniques for learning new words to the kind of the broader impact of expanding your vocabulary.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey for sure. And I think it really highlights the fact that language learning, it isn't just about accumulating more and more words. It's really about unlocking these new possibilities for thinking, for communicating, even for experiencing the world.
Absolutely. It's like we've been saying all along, it's so much more than just memorizing definitions. It's really about expanding your horizons in so many different ways. But as we wrap things up, I'd love to kind of leave our listeners with one final thought, something, kind of provocative, something to ponder, something that maybe sparks some further exploration. What do you think?
Okay, let me see. Well, we've talked so much about how to learn new words, right? But I'm kind of curious, what is it that sparks that initial desire to learn in the first place? What motivates someone to embark on this whole vocabulary journey to begin with?
That's a great question. I think it often stems from this innate sense of curiosity, like a desire to understand the world more deeply or to connect with others more meaningfully or to be able to express oneself more fully.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's that spark of curiosity that fuels the learning process. And it makes me think, how can we nurture that curiosity? Not just for vocabulary, but for knowledge in general?
Ooh, that's such a good point to end on. Because, yeah, it's not just about learning new words. It's really about cultivating this lifelong love of learning.
Exactly. So, dear listeners, as you continue to explore this vast and wonderful world of language, Remember to stay curious, keep questioning, never stop discovering.
And who knows, maybe along the way you'll even find like a new favorite word to describe the sheer joy of learning. Happy exploring, everyone.